What's up everybody, it's Tom. Welcome to part one of my How to Do a Kegerator video series where I teach you everything you need to know to serve your own draft beer, cider, mead, kombucha at home. So in front of us here, I've got some tanks. This is a nitrogen tank, this is a CO2 tank. Gas is the cornerstone of any draft system because we need pressure, we need some gas, we need to move that liquid out of the keg and into your glass. So the first thing we start with is a tank and a regulator. Nitrogen is a little bit less common. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So we'll put that aside, put it in. CO2 though, however, is used in all sorts of processes for cider, for kombucha, for beer. Super important. You need this guy to get your carbonation, your fizz, to get it out of the keg into your glass and tasting just right. This is a 5-pound tank. These are both 5-pound tanks. And there's a couple of numbers printed on the tank that I want you to be aware of and what they mean. Most of these we don't need to know about. There's some lot dates, DOT symbol there, but what we need to know as consumers and owners of these is the production date, and right here that's 06/21, so June of 2021, that's when this tank was made. And then the other number that's important is the tare weight. That's over here, it's printed in both pounds and kilograms. Tare weight on this tank is 7.6 pounds. That means this tank weighs 7.6 pounds with absolutely nothing inside of it and nothing attached to it. Aside of a tank, we also need a regulator. A regulator is a device that attaches to the tank and it controls how much gas comes out of your tank at once. If we didn't use a regulator, I'm going to show you here, this is what happens. A little bit loud, my ears hurt. The gas just comes out as quickly as it wants. There's absolutely nothing controlling it. If you just let it open like that, this tank would empty super fast. It'll get icy cold. That's not what we want when we're serving beer. So what a regulator does is that goes in between the tank and your draft system to control how much gas is coming out at once. Because we want to make sure that we're putting just the right amount of pressure into our draft systems. Here in Denver, at our altitude, we recommend you use or start with around 10 to 14 psi. 12 is usually what I recommend to start with. That's the right in between number. It'll get you around 2.5 to 3 volumes of CO2 dissolved in your beer, depending on how cold it is. On the regulator itself, we've got a few different regulators here. This is a standard one. This is what you call a single body dual gauge regulator. It has one body, that's this piece here in the center, and has 2 gauges. There's a gauge showing the serving pressure, or the pressure you have coming out of the regulator, and then there's also a gauge showing the pressure from the tank. And this pressure gauge can fluctuate a little bit. If the tank is hot, if the tank is cold, it's reading a pressure and not a true volume. So if the tank gets cold, the pressure is going to go down. If the tank gets hot, the pressure goes up, just because of the way the gas inside here wants to move around. So if your tank is in the garage, it gets really cold overnight, we get a cold snap or something like that, and all of a sudden the pressure drops, don't freak out and think that you have to go get new gas. You probably have gas still in here, it just might be condensed because of the cold, and now your gauge is reading low. Super common issue. I see it all the time here. Over Christmas, I had to turn away about a half dozen guys who had full tanks and they thought they had no gas in there. If you're ever really unsure, that's where that tare weight that I talked about is super important, because you can pop this onto a scale and subtract the tare weight, and that tells you the actual amount of gas you have in here. When completely filled, this 5-pound tank will hold 7.6 pounds plus 5, so 12.6 pounds. It's just as easy as that. Super important, before I forget, when you're attaching your regulator, you need to make sure you're using a nylon washer. I've got a little red guy here attached on these regulators. We have little white ones. The color doesn't matter. You'll see different versions of them. Surprisingly, for this joint right here, you do not use any tape. You'll see this tape on the regulator itself. This is a little bit different connection points. But for this one, because we have this washer in place here, that's all you need. Your washer in place first. You line it up, swivel until it's hand tight, right about there. And then I'll rotate this down a little bit so that when I grab my wrench and I actually tighten it all the way, it'll turn and the gauge faces outward. Not a huge deal, it just makes your life a little bit easier. You want to make sure you put a real good snug twist onto here, and once this is hooked up, then open the valve here and check for leaks. Usually you can hear a leak if it's pretty quiet in the room, but if you're hard of hearing, it's not a quiet place, you want to be doubly sure, grab a spray bottle full of some soapy water or some star sand, and you just spray some of these connection points here, or when you have the hose hooked up here, and that'll make sure that if you have any leaks, you'll see them immediately. To adjust these guys, on the tap right versions, you pull this knob out, back it off all the way, and then slowly start turning this until the gauge goes up. And I'm going to show that as I talk here. So you slowly turn that until it goes up. It's at where you want it. And then you push down and snap and closed. Now you're good to go. In front of us here, I've got a few different regulator styles that I think I'd talk about. So this one is a very, very standard single body dual gauge. Most homebrewers have one that looks like that. This is what you would call a dual body triple gauge. And you can get these, they continue to get larger. I have one that's 4 at home myself, up to, I'm sure you could probably get an 8 one. You can basically just daisy chain these bodies together along with a different gauge for each body's pressure. And you'll notice here, each body also has a different output with a different valve. So you'd want one of these if you were serving 2 different beverages using 2 different pressures, because you could have one of them be higher than the other. The only tricky thing is you need to make sure that the ones close to the tank, highest to lowest going this way. Because if you set this one at 10, it's only going to allow 10 to continue passing through this way. Highest pressure closest to the tank, lowest pressure to the outside of the tank. But then the advantage of a style like this is if you want to serve a hard seltzer or cider, you can have your 25 to 30 psi on your first gauge, and then you've got a beer on your second one. This one's down to 12. Because you'll need a higher pressure for different beverages. It allows you to do that. Just have just 2 pressures, 2 different things pouring at the same time. Whereas this basically allows you to do the same thing, but this is a kind of more of an add-on. So this is what we call a secondary regulator. If you can imagine, it sort of replaces one of these. You have this already in your home setup, and now you want to add a way of controlling 2 different pressures. You can branch off of this T, so it goes to 1 keg, and then have one come to here, and this is downstream now, lower pressure. Again, that way you can have more than one beverage pouring at a time, 2 different pressures, a high pressure and a lower pressure. Add-on option if you wanted to do any of this in the future. And now let's go over to nitrogen. And so nitrogen has a different connection. You'll see here, it has male threading on the regulator itself. Doesn't need a little washer because it's built into the stem. And that one goes in like this. There's not a huge amount of differences though between the actual regulators and how they function. This one has a different knob on the front here. We can just ignore that, but you'll notice it's pretty much the same thing. We have a pressure gauge here, pressure gauge here. The one main difference you'll notice is that this gauge goes a little higher. It goes to 3,000 psi because nitrogen typically has a higher pressure at room temperature than CO2 does. So nitrogen setups, you would be interested in this if you want to do a Guinness pour at home, if you want to do a beer gas mixture, that's 25% nitrogen, 75% CO2. With beer gas, gets you some of that creamy mouthfeel pour, but keeps the carbonation a little bit lower. Or if you want to do cold brew setup, nitrogen is the way to do it. That way you're still pouring and you're serving a beer without adding additional CO2 on top of that. So there's other areas where you want to use that, but typically we see them for stout faucet setup or for cold brew or sometimes beer gas. That is the first part of my series. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, I'll try to get back to them as best I can. Keep your eyes peeled for the next parts of these videos, and I'm going to be talking about every individual component of your draft system, but today we're just going to talk about these CO2 tanks, regulators, nitrogen, cornerstone, the beginning of all our process. We got to make sure we got gas to move our liquid. Well, thanks for watching everybody, and have a great day.